Before we begin, I just wanted to quickly introduce everyone to this tutorial. So first off, while we're not going step by step, this is a beginner level tutorial, so we will be going over the very basics of operating your camera settings. And speaking of that, because there is so many different camera brands and operating systems, I'm going to assume that you already know how to navigate your camera and change its settings, because if we were to go through every single camera, then it would take too long. And yeah, because this is an entry level tutorial, we will be using general terms such as ISO, shutter speed, aperture, rather than their professional cousins such as EIT stop or etc. That's also because most of the cameras that we're using don't even have options for that, so why bother? So let me tell you a bit about myself and why I'm a reputable source. So, I've been a filmmaker and photographer for the past 7 years. I started back in grade 7 taking photos of my friends and family trips, and then I slowly transitioned into doing video work, shooting for companies, bands, artists, and more. And a couple of my biggest accomplishments were working with Gymshark, Milwaukee Tools, and various other promoters and companies and even cities. I'm completely self-taught, so I firmly believe in the saying that you never stop learning, because I know I never did. Anyways, let's get into today's seminar in camera basics. Let's get started with an overview of the different types of cameras that you will see when shooting. First, you'll see some seasoned YouTube vloggers and photographers that also shoot video carrying on the big and chunky DSLRs. These cameras were designed with photography as their first priority. With that being said, there are still some DSLRs that have good video specs and will give you decent results. Next up is the most common camera that intermediate filmmakers have, and that's a mirrorless camera. These cameras are well known for great video specs as well as being able to take amazing photos. And due to their inexpensive nature, many creators use them. And now we get in the prosumer range. These are for the people that have been doing this for a long time, need a proper video camera, but don't have the budget for or need for a cinema camera. And these are the entry-level cinema cameras. This is a fairly new type of camera, as before there was a really thick line between consumer and professional video cameras. Now these cameras, like the Sony FX3, like I have in the slide, allow everyday people to have access to top-of-the-line cameras. And then finally, since we mentioned them, we have professional cameras. These are the cameras that you'll see on film sets, TV shows, and also the ones that will eventually take over your dreams. So, when filming, you need to have three things in mind when it comes to your camera settings. Those are aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. And all of those together allow you to control how bright your image is, or what is known as exposure. Let's get through these real quick. Shutter speed is the amount of time that light is able to get into your sensor. In most modern day cameras, the shutter is digital and turns your sensor on and off. But there are still a couple cameras out there that have a physical shutter, especially for photos. A fast shutter speed, for example 1/1000th of a second, will let in the least amount of light, but will also freeze moving objects in place, like the bird on the left. On the other hand, a slow shutter speed, like 1/10th of a second, will let in the most amount of light, but will allow for moving objects to be blurred, just like the bird on the far right. But more on this later. Aperture relates to the size of the opening in your lens, as you can see on the left graphic. The larger the opening, the more light comes into your camera, and the less range you have while focusing. Meaning, if you're focusing on something close, like the girl in the left picture, then the background will be blurry. The same goes the other way, where if your opening is small, so an aperture of 22, for example, you'll have less light coming in, but you'll also have a greater range while focusing. So both your foreground and your background will be there. And just like shutter speed, you have to balance aperture with the last item, ISO, to get the perfect exposure for your shot. Speaking of ISO, ISO is how sensitive your sensor is to light itself. The lower the ISO value, the less sensitive, the higher, the more sensitive. But one thing to keep in mind, the higher you set your ISO, the more distorted or noisy your image gets. As you can see here in the ISO 3200 example, there's a much more grainy noise as compared to the 800 example. And putting those all together create the exposure triangle. The exposure triangle is probably the most important graphic to get accustomed to because using this will allow you to see what makes your image brighter, what makes your image darker, and will allow you to perfectly expose your image. Now that you're familiar with the three main parts of exposure, let's introduce the fourth part, specifically important for video, the frame rate. A video is just a bunch of pictures put together and played in a sequence. The speed of that sequence, or how many photos are in 1 second, is called the frame rate. Frame rates can be anything from 10 frames a second to 34 to even a couple thousand frames per second. The most common frames per second that you'll find is 24, 30, and 60. And using a high frame rate, for example 120 frames per second, allows you to slow down your footage, and in this example almost up to 8 times, to get really nice slow motion shots. The frame rate you use depends on exactly what you are trying to capture, but the most popular one in today's filmmaking world is 24 frames per second, or to be more specific, 23.98 frames per second. That's because, when matched with the correct shutter speed, it's believed to be the most realistic looking. Let me explain. With videos being a series of pictures, each frame has the same characteristics as a single photo. When you have a slow shutter speed and a moving subject, they end up blurry, and that's known as motion blur. Your eyes work the same way. Try shaking your arm back and forth. Notice how it's not crystal clear and it has a sort of trail behind it? It's the same thing. So, when directors are planning their film, they'll consider what exactly they want their motion blur to look like. Do they want everything to be super sharp, or do they want to leave in some blur? In most cases, they choose to leave in some blur to make the video seem more natural, which also helps keep the audience invested in their movie. Now, I might have confused you. What does frame rate have to do with motion blur? Well, let me introduce you to the shutter angle. Shutter angle. Before digital shutters, film cameras used a rotating disc to control the shutter speed. Just like a modern day shutter, these discs controlled how long each frame was exposed to light, which means they would also control the motion blur of each frame. The smaller the angle, the faster the shutter speed, the less blur there was, and vice versa. What directors soon found out was a shutter angle of 180 degrees produced the most true-to-life motion blur, meaning that if they shook their arm in the film, it would look just like shaking an arm in person. And finally, the reason this is all in the frame rate section is simply because the shutter angle is calculated by the frame rate of the film. As you can see, a shutter angle of 180 degrees covers the green frame for half of the time, meaning that half of a circle is what that disc is. So, half of a circle, 180 degrees, right? Pretty simple. Now, if you're anything like me, you don't have a disc inside your camera that you can change out to change the shutter angle. You want to be able to translate this into shutter speed, so then you can actually input that into your camera. And there is a little math involved, but it's extremely simple. The formula to calculate your shutter speed from a shutter angle is the frame rate of your project multiplied by 360 and then divided by the shutter angle you want. So for this example, we'll do a project of 24 frames per second, and we want to have a shutter angle of 180, which gives you 48, which gives you a shutter speed of 1/48. Another thing, most cameras won't let you input the exact shutter speed that you want. So for this example, you would do 1/50. since it's the closest to 1/48. And that's basically it. So now you guys know all the basics in setting up your camera settings to be video ready. There are still many things to learn, such as framing, the codec you're recording in, what picture profile you're using, and you might still want to learn post-processing and color grading, or how to even use the editor you're using. But that being said, this tutorial, if you follow it, you're more likely to succeed in getting a good looking video than just setting your camera to auto and letting the camera do all the work. And be on the lookout for some future seminars where we'll go over framing, advanced camera settings, editing, and more. And yeah, thank you for coming out. And if you have any questions, now's the time. You can go in the chat, you can raise your hand.